Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, for our very first show of the new year, we have an unbelievably special guest, the one and only Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. Dr. Sheldrake joins us to talk about his latest book, Science and Spiritual Practices, which is already available to you lucky people in the UK, or you lazy people, me basically, who never got around to updating Kindle Store country preferences since leaving the UK 18 months ago. A fantastic chat, unsurprisingly. Dr. Sheldrake, thank you very much for your time.
It's good to be with you.
Wonderful. So I have a traditional first question here, but I would like to switch it up a bit for your good self, because the listeners are, by and large, very familiar with your work, and we all cheer along when we hear you talk about things like materialism and so on. And you've been at this for a little while. So my first question, Dr. Sheldrake, is, are we winning?
Oh, yes, I think so. I mean, the dogmatic materialist worldview is crumbling. I show that in my previous book, The Science Delusion. And since that book came out, things have changed even further. For example, in evolutionary theory, neo-Darwinism is now regarded as sort of old hat. I mean, the idea it's just random mutations and natural selection is untenable because of the rise of epigenetics in the last 10 to 15 years. And now people are calling for a new evolutionary synthesis, a whole new way of understanding evolution. Within physics, the problems of dark matter and dark energy have got worse, not better, because all attempts to find the supposed source of dark matter have failed, and people are saying, well, does this really exist? Rather than assuming it exists, and it's only a matter of time before we find out what it is. Consciousness remains the very hard problem for materialists, and the more and more materialists are jumping ship and becoming panpsychists, thinking there must be some kind of mind or consciousness throughout all nature. And the dogmatic atheists are, losing their grip. I mean, Richard Dawkins, for example, is a kind of spent force here in Britain. And meanwhile, more and more professed atheists are taking up spiritual practices. Susan Blackmore here in Britain is now a regular meditator. Sam Harris, one of the so-called new atheists, is now giving online meditation courses. And so I think that the mood is shifting dramatically. And among young people, there's a much greater openness to a more holistic view than I've seen for a very long time.
And is it sort of smelling the air like that made you think now is the time to write this particular book? Because for a number of reasons, having read a lot of your previous stuff, for a number of reasons, it's something of a step change, because it almost feels like we can have these discussions in a more open way now.
Yes, well, it is more or less what I feel. I mean, the fact that there's been such a big shift, even among atheists and secularists, it's not any longer a question of, the expanded mind, psychedelic, spiritual experience is all rubbish compared with the dogmatic materialist view. It's a question of, what kind of spiritual practices work and why do they work and what do they do to you and so on, and what's really going on. That's really the debate now, and there's been so many scientific studies of the effects of spiritual practices, including, I would include taking psychedelics in that category. I think there's been so many studies now, particularly of meditation, that it's really a kind of scientific discussion. It's not a kind of science versus airy-fairy nonsense. It's very different. And the impact on health and well-being of spiritual practices are now so widely recognized that I think we can have a conversation about science and spiritual practices, which is the theme of my book.
Absolutely. Funnily enough, you mentioned psychedelics. Saint Terence of McKenna gets a nod in the acknowledgements of the new book. And in many respects, I think one of the ways I really enjoyed it, and perhaps one of the ways it's a step change, is it's very autobiographical. The preface is a fascinating insight into your life, but it's sort of, I'm going to pose the question, how long have you been writing it in that wider sense? How long has this been something you've been considering? Once you move past, is this real or is it not? In the widest possible sense, it's what can we learn about this, and how does it help our life, and what does it mean? So, is this a book you've been writing for a while, given your previous friendship with Terence?
Well, yes. I mean, I've been interested in these things for decades. I mean, I've been meditating on and off since 1971, and so the spiritual practices of various kinds, singing and chanting, meditation and pilgrimage, and so on, are things that I myself have practiced for a long time, but they were somewhat in a separate compartment from my scientific work. Because it was rather hard to talk about them in a kind of public forum rather than just in private. So the ingredients of this book are the product of years of thought on my own part and practice. So I haven't actually physically been writing the book for very long, but a year or two before a couple of years before it came out. But I've been thinking about these things for many, many years and discussing them with friends. And, of course, my discussions with Terence McKenna and Ralph Abraham in the trialogues that we've published, both online and in book form, cover a lot of these areas. They're really to do with the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the universe and to what lies beyond the universe, and to the extent of our minds, how far our minds go.
I think there's, particularly when it comes to meditation, that long personal experience shines through. And you have, which I'll also turn into a question, a really thought-provoking way of differentiating between meditation and prayer. So, Dr. Sheldrake, what is the difference between meditation and prayer?
Well, there's many kinds of prayer, and one kind in the Christian tradition called contemplative prayer, sort of silent prayer, is more or less meditation. It's something that monks and nuns have practiced for many centuries in monasteries and convents, and many lay people too. But prayer, as it's normally understood, the prayer, the kind of that most people who pray about, is petitionary prayer, asking for something, and often for healing or for support or protection or for success in business or exams. I mean, people's prayers are often about quite mundane things that are part of their lives. Meditation is about letting go of everyday concerns, letting them float past as one concentrates on breathing or the mantra. And so that the point of meditation is to disengage the mind and the thoughts from everyday concerns, to get to a place which is closer to the ground of consciousness itself. So I compare meditation to breathing in. It's like you're breathing in, becoming more inward, whereas prayers, petitionary prayer, is more like breathing out. It's connecting the source of the spirit. I mean, all prayers begin with an invocation, like Our Father or Hail Mary or Om Namah Shivaya, or there's an invocation at the beginning of each prayer, which is connecting to the spiritual source that the prayer is addressed to, and then with that connection, forming intentions, beaming out intentions into the world or into the future, like an intention for healing, where it's not letting go of things of this world, it's actually connecting the spirit with things of this world and things of one's concerns in the world. So that's, in the sense, going in the opposite direction from meditation. Both of them are spiritual practices, but one's disengaging and the other's engaging. So that's why I think they're complementary. I don't think it's I myself pray and meditate. I meditate in the mornings and pray in the evenings. So I think they're complementary rather than contradictory or opposite.
Just like breathing in and out.
Just like breathing in and out, yes.
You want to do both, absolutely. Well, funnily enough, on that, so my mother, speaking of your experience with meditation in India and so on, has just got back from India a few days ago. So she's visiting, and over the course of preparing for our discussion, I put a few videos of previous interviews of yours on YouTube, and she's nodding along vigorously as a former school psychologist and regular meditator and, regular visitor to India. So for the benefit of the people listening, because she particularly enjoyed this bit, what are some of the empirically observed benefits of regular meditation?
Well, there are a whole lot of them, and some of them are physiological. Lowering of blood pressure, reducing levels of stress hormones in the blood, sleeping better, feeling less symptoms of stress, less depression. People who meditate regularly are less prone to depression, and for people who are depressed, taking up meditation can help relieve their depression, which is why on the British National Health Service it's now possible to get prescriptions for meditation from doctors. And the reason that you can do that is because clinical trials and some scientific studies have shown that for people who have mild or moderate depression, meditation is more effective and cheaper than long courses of antidepressant drugs, and of course has no side effects. So there's now a lot of evidence that meditation benefits health, which is why so many people do it. In America, about 18 million people meditate. In Oriental religions and in all religions, the main reason for meditation has been to contact the ground of being, to link one's mind with the greater mind that underlies the cosmos. But it's now possible to meditate in a purely secular spirit. It's good for you. It enhances health and well-being. And most people who meditate don't necessarily think very much about the underlying historical basis of it, but they're definitely interested in health and well-being and feeling better and their lives being more fulfilling. And that's why most people do it. And of course, it's free.
Yeah. Well, there's another one I want to talk about there, but do you think, as you say, secular people meditate and mindfulness meditation is very popular in a corporate setting and so on now. Do you think what's happened if you're a materialist or a naive secularist without having done much analysis of it, do you think if people meditate within that sort of worldview or framework for a sufficient amount of time, they'll bump up against the edge of their worldview? And the reason I ask that is in the natural world chapter, we talk about forest bathing, which is another one of these things that you can insufficiently describe in a materialist framework. But so you add that and a regular meditation practice together, and you can trundle off to Google in a little Google bus and do your meditation on the Google Blue yoga mats and then go for a walk in the forest or whatever. Do you think if they do these things for long enough, the sum of the effects is actually greater than the materialist described parts? Is there a kind of way that we're hiding the kids' vegetables in the rest of the food here?
Well, I don't think that's the reason that people developed these secular meditation techniques. Mindfulness meditation and the relaxation response developed in the 1970s originally as secular procedures. I don't think we're hiding the vegetables exactly. I think they were, just medically based realizations of the benefits. But I do think that if people do it regularly, the question of the nature of consciousness is going to come up. And the materialist answer that it's nothing but the activity of the brain may seem less and less satisfying. And I think that's one reason that people who do meditate, materialists who meditate regularly, start having doubts about the materialist worldview. For example, I had a discussion with Susan Blackmore just 2 or 3 weeks ago, and she's one of Britain's most prominent public atheists. She's a hardline skeptic against all psychic phenomena, but she's been meditating for years, mostly using a Zen form of meditation. And when I asked her if she was still a materialist, she said no, she's not a materialist. She's now become a panpsychist. And more materialists are becoming panpsychists. What they're saying is that the mind is, there's something of the mind even in electrons and atoms and molecules, that it's not as if the whole of the universe is unconscious and then the light bulb of consciousness just switches on inside human brains. That there's a difference of degree, not of kind. Well, you see, that's quite an interesting step forward, and many materialists are now becoming panpsychists because it seems a way out of the hard problem. Instead of consciousness being inexplicable in a world of totally unconscious matter, or an epiphenomenon, something that doesn't do anything, then consciousness becomes something that's built into nature. But I think that...
I was just going to say, I'm going to ask your opinion of panpsychism, because I think when you said that it's sort of a step in the right direction is potentially as far as I would. That's what I think of panpsychism, because I do think it's the last refuge of materialists, because I think it's a fudge like the multi-world or multiverse theory to try and it's like the last-ditch attempt of materialism, because it's all well and good to join us in saying that matter can have an interiority and that fundamentally changes a foundational premise. But it still leaves you with this kind of unusual anthropocentric Lego blocking where, okay, then the human brain isn't actually the most, well, it probably is one of the most complex assemblages of, molecules that we have, but complexity of mind and consciousness doesn't match complexity of Lego blocks. And I just wonder if it's wonderful that they're actually at the table of saying, okay, consciousness is fundamental, but panpsychism isn't really the end model, is it?
Well, I think the first step in trying to go beyond this more limited kind that we're seeing today is to think it through. And that's one reason why in my book, Science and Spiritual Practices, I have a section discussing the consciousness of the sun. Because most panpsychist discussions concentrate on electrons or atoms, and of course it's very hard to imagine what the mind of an atom or an electron might be like. But they're conveniently smaller than us and less conscious than us, presumably. But if you take panpsychism seriously, it must apply to big things as well as small things. And the test case, then, I think, is the best test case, is the sun. The sun is a large self-organizing system. It has extremely complex electromagnetic patterns of activity. It has regular pulsing waves of electromagnetism. It reverses polarity every 11 years. Its magnetic polarity reverses with the sunspot cycle. And so the question is, if the electromagnetic activity of our brain is the interface between the physical, the material activity and our mental activity, then why can't the sun be conscious? If panpsychism applies to all things that are self-organizing, it's certainly self-organizing. And so then, as soon as you get the idea the sun might be conscious, then it's a very different debate from if you're talking about an electron. It's got a bigger, at least brain. The sun, if that's equivalent to the brain, it's far bigger than ours. It's much more complex. The sphere of activity of the entire solar system is open to the sun. We're within the sun's electromagnetic field. We're within the gravitational field and entirely within the field of the sun. What if the sun knows what's going on here on Earth? what if what goes on in our minds is open to the sun? What if the sun is not like some kind of primitive vegetable mind, but some kind of super mind that includes what's going on in the solar system? And then what if the other stars are like the sun? And what if the galaxy has an even greater mind than the solar system? It's, after all, composed of billions of stars and solar systems. And then what if that's true? Then what about the entire cosmos and the mind of the whole cosmos? So, you see, if you follow through on panpsychism, instead of seeing our minds as the ultimate because our brains are more complex than molecules or electrons, they don't look that way anymore if you take into account the consciousness of the entire universe or the solar system or the galaxy. So I think that panpsychism is attractive, as you suggest, to materialists because it looks like a way out of the problems of materialism. But it's actually the top of a very slippery slope that very quickly leads towards a kind of pantheism. And that could lead on beyond pantheism to wider views still. So I think it's a kind of temporary position that looks good at the moment. But when I tried this out on Susan Blackmore, and she hasn't got any arguments against the sun being conscious other than, well, how do you know? But I mean, how do you know an electron's conscious? So,
yes, I view it as a good sign in that sense. It's that, back to question one, are we winning? It's a back foot position that I don't think they've necessarily considered the implications of. It might have been better for them to just man that line that consciousness is an illusion, perhaps, because why I asked it and why I wanted to see your opinion of panpsychism as a sufficiently descriptive model is in some of the chapters in this book we talk about, or you write about pilgrimage and things like sacred objects. They don't work in Susan Blackmore's panpsychism, but nevertheless they work. So it's well and good. Everyone listening to this is on board with you with the sun and the galaxy and so on. But panpsychism wobbles a bit when you try to find, molecular arrangements or quote unquote objects that fall outside that fudge, and that's, I think, what I hope you're referring to when you say it is the top of a very slippery slope and an exciting one, I think, for these debates moving forward.
Oh yes, definitely. Yes, I think it's a step in the right direction, and then you see the debate can move on from there. Whereas the debate is completely stuck if one's dealing with dogmatic materialism. There are still dogmatic materialists around. Daniel Dennett, for example, is one of the most sophisticated ones. But he's just simply assumes as an axiom, it's a simple, fundamental, unchangeable principle that matter's unconscious and it's the only reality. So it's really a dogmatic belief system. What's so interesting is that Susan Blackmore's moved on. Galen Strawson, who's a philosopher, has moved on and become a panpsychist. Thomas Nagel, the American philosopher of mind, has become a panpsychist. Christoph Koch, the formerly hardline materialist neuroscientist, he's become a panpsychist. Most of them are still within this rather limited form we've been talking about, but they don't have any way of resisting the argument moving on. I had a discussion with Galen Strawson in London a few months ago. Again, I talked about the consciousness of the sun, and he hadn't thought about it, but when we discussed it, it was clear that he hadn't got any strong argument that would rule out bigger things being conscious and the possibility that there are bigger forms of consciousness than our own. So I think we're in a transitional phase at the moment, and some panpsychists may retreat into old-style materialism, but those that go on are going to be entering completely new terrain. And
in that forgiving sense, in a way, we want them there. One of the questions I had towards the end, although it's unlikely we'll get to it, is how you would fix the study of biology if you were granted that superpower on Earth. But now that we've moved past the is it, isn't it discussion, a lot of good can come from there being, more hands on deck, more people having these talks and thinking about it.
Oh, yes. I mean, science is a collective endeavor, and if science is going to move on, it has to move on with, a general shift in attitudes about what questions are permissible to explore and which questions are interesting and so on. So I think it's very important that the whole context opens up. And what's interesting, again, in this is that I mention it in my book, a recent survey that was carried out by the British Scientific and Medical Network of scientific engineering and medical professionals in Britain, France, and Germany. And this was to find out whether the caricature view of most scientists, doctors, and engineers being materialists is true. And I know it's not true because I'm always meeting people in the medical and scientific and engineering professions who are not hardcore materialists. Because I'm out of the closet, as it were, that people feel free to speak to me, and I know there are a lot who aren't. Anyway, what the survey shows is that about 25% of the scientific, medical, and engineering community are atheists, about 20% agnostic, so about 45% classify themselves as non-religious. But about 45% classify themselves as spiritual and or religious. So it's about equal numbers. When it comes to things like taking psychedelics, going to alternative therapies, and meditating, a significant number of the non-religious people in the scientific world do these things. So it's not as if the entire scientific world consists of hardcore Dawkins-type atheists. They're a minority, and the number of people who are more open in the scientific world is quite large. A lot of scientists would welcome an opening up of science, but they can't do anything about it as long as the overwhelming orthodoxy is materialist. They have to play the game by the rules. But if the rules change, there'd be a lot of people who'd welcome this and who would switch over to a much broader conception of what science can do. And of course, part of that change will depend on funding agencies being ready to fund more unconventional research. But it's a chicken and egg thing because the funding agencies do what the scientific orthodoxy says is worth doing. But if the scientific orthodoxy changes, then the funding of science will change as well. And I think that some of these examples I give in my book, Science and Spiritual Practices, of scientific investigations of these spiritual practices, which have been funded, show that already there's research going on into these areas. Admittedly, most of it's a kind of utilitarian in the sense it's concerned with health and well-being, but after all, we're all interested in health and well-being, so that's not a bad thing. So I think things are already changing, and research on spiritual practices is one sign of that change.
One of those examples, if you'd like, that there's in the book that I hadn't heard of and I think is interesting on that utilitarian level that you mentioned, but its implications, I think, are substantial. So tell us about the singing and music studies in nursing homes.
Oh, yes. Well, there have been quite a few studies now of people in nursing homes, particularly those with dementia, who respond to music. It's very interesting. Music sort of gets below the level of normal verbal communication. It's more fundamental in the sense that it involves, rhythmic activities, movements of muscles, people tapping their feet. It's much more bodily than just mental. And many people who've have done studies now, and there's lots of informal studies as well. I mean, a lot of nursing homes have regular singing sessions because it sort of wakes people up, people who may be in a sort of shut-in state or who just seem to be absent, come back into their bodies and into the present when they hear music. And studies have shown that people become more alert, that the levels of stress go down when people hear music. and it has a generally beneficial effect. It doesn't cure people. It's not as if you just need a bit of music and Alzheimer's will go away, but it ameliorates the condition of those who are suffering from these things because it brings them more into the present in a way that they can also connect with their memories, because the people may have lost their memory for a lot of things, but surprisingly, memories for tunes or for music persist in many cases. So music has a powerful effect, and not just in people in nursing homes. There's now lots of studies that show that through singing in choirs, singing together with other people, has beneficial effects. People feel more bonded, less lonely, more connected, happier, more in the flow, and just more connected with a sort of greater reality, which is why singing and chanting are part of every single cultural and musical tradition in the world, and every religious tradition too.
Here's an interesting question that the amazing research in these sort of 7 different practices that you cover in the book sort of begs, which is in this sort of utilitarian description of the benefits of many of these practices. We've covered things like meditation and the use of music and ritual and so on. We're not very good. Well, you and I potentially are, but we're not very good at describing the, like, you know, a generalized well-being or a reduction in, experience of depression and so on. These are all great, but it's necessary but insufficient descriptions. And I guess my question is, what does it imply about the world? And this is a thought I had as I'm reading your book, Dr. Sheldrake, that the sort of emerging medical best practice, particularly if you add in autophagy and fasting, which, you know, is the Nobel Prize for Medicine for last year, what does it say about the world that medical best practice now looks like the sort of spiritual and coherent life you would find among the Pythagoreans? That's odd in toto, isn't it?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think part of it is, you see, that we're social beings, and we're beings that need meaning and purpose. And medicine can deal with, in its materialist form, it can help in many ways through drugs that relieve pain, that kill antibiotics, and surgery that can replace aching hips and repair injuries. I mean, there's many advantages, huge advantages to modern medicine, but it doesn't give a sense of purpose in life. It doesn't give a sense of meaning. It doesn't give a sense of connection with other people. It doesn't give a sense of, a deep inner connection with the source of all things. These are things that traditionally religions have given people, and generally speaking, make them happier, healthier, and live longer. People with regular religious practices are indeed happier, healthier, and live longer, as many studies have now shown. Medicine can't give us those things. And insofar as medicine's concerned with general well-being, not just physical but mental well-being, insofar as it has to deal with psychiatric conditions and depression and things like that, these other aspects become increasingly important. It's also become very clear through medical research over the last few decades that a lot of healing, even within conventional medicine, depends on the so-called placebo effect. People who think they're getting a blank pill in a clinical trial often get better because they think they're getting a wonder drug, and actually they're just getting a blank pill. What people expect, what they believe, how they feel cared for and loved and looked after, actually measurably affect health and healing. So these things have to be part of a comprehensive medical approach. It can't just concern itself with molecules inside the body and the mechanical functioning of joints. These other factors play an enormous part. And that's why a spiritual practice like pilgrimage, which gives a sense of connection with the earth, connection and meaning with holy places, with history, tradition, with a greater consciousness or purpose, and so on, can have powerful healing effects. When people go to a healing shrine like Lourdes in France, where hundreds of thousands of people go every year, where there's healing well, many people get better. And if you think about the placebo effect, that's not surprising. Placebo effect happens when people feel that they're getting a treatment that could work, they're being looked after, they're being cared for, they have hope of getting better rather than despair at getting worse. It would be very surprising if people who go on pilgrimages to healing shrines don't get better in the light of what we know about the placebo effect. So I think that this is another area, you see, where medicine, through its own lines of research, through placebo-controlled, double-blind clinical trials, the gold standard for medicine, has sort of run up against something which goes beyond medicine, namely the placebo effect. But it's undeniably now within the sphere of medicine, the fact that this happens. And how to make it happen more is or should be part of an integrated medical system. And that's something where traditional spiritual and religious practices can play a part in healing.
Well, absolutely. It in many ways, if it was the science set free, to use the American title of the previous book, it's its job to find the placebo effect, but it's also its job, and this is where it's failed, as you say, to how do we make this happen more? How do we take it to the next level? Not to run up against it and say, oh, that's a bit odd. And I think that was kind of my question with mindfulness meditation. I delight in the idea of these materialist technocrats thinking that buying the brain chemistry change, which happens, a component of corporate mindfulness meditation, because if they do it for long enough, they'll be on annual leave in an ashram before they know it.
Yes, or just practicing it before going to work in the morning. Or yes, I mean, I think these things will signal a kind of cultural transformation that's going on at the moment, and increasing numbers of people are adopting healthier diets and lifestyles, and of course lots of people aren't, which is why we've got an obesity epidemic. But it's perfectly clear that not doing anything about it, just going on eating what food is advertised on television and what's prominently displayed in supermarkets, and following the consumerist lifestyle is actually lethal. It will see a decreasing life expectancy as this obesity epidemic takes off. And so it's becoming more and more pressing to find ways of going beyond it. In a sense, consumerist materialism is a victim of its own success, in that it's not leading to ever healthier lifestyles. It's leading to less and less healthy lifestyles as more and more people spend time on social media, not going outdoors, consuming more things, eating fatty foods, etc., and carb-rich foods. It's almost forcing a rethink of how we lead our lives.
So I'm aware of your time constraints, Dr. Sheldrake, so I'm going to ask you the final question, well, semi-question. What are the 7 spiritual practices as described in this book? Are there just 7? Yeah.
Well, the 7 I describe in this book, there aren't just 7, there are more, and in fact I'm writing a sequel to this book which deals with another 7. But the 7 in this book are, first, meditation, because that's the one that's had the most research done on it, and is one of the most widely practiced spiritual practices today. I mean, millions and millions of people do it. So that's the first. The second is gratitude. All religions emphasize the need for being grateful, for counting our blessings, for being thankful for what we have, instead of complaining about what we haven't. And there's now a lot of research that shows that people who are grateful are happier. And what's more popular, it's much more fun to be around someone who's grateful and cheerful than someone who's moaning and complaining all the time. Then connecting with nature is a practice which, again, has been part of spiritual traditions all around the world. It's something which is part of the shamanic traditions which precede all the religions. And it's just part of our human nature to be connected with nature. Our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, and they wouldn't have survived very long if they weren't connected with nature, if they didn't have a close link with animals and with plants. And also our agricultural ancestors had to be connected with nature through the seasons, through the crops they grew and the animals they kept. And I think this is a deep part of human nature. And even in modern cities, where people don't need to grow their own food or keep their own animals, huge numbers of people keep pets, dogs, cats, and other animals, because they feel this need to connect and be linked to the animal kingdom. Lots of people have gardening and have house plants, window boxes, or whatever, or even just cut flowers, because of this basic human need to connect with the realm of plants. And that's I have a whole chapter on relating to plants, because I think that's such an important part of our lives. All of these take us beyond ourselves into connection with a much greater reality than our more limited human reality. And that the natural world and the world of plants connects to realms of beauty, creativity, the ultimate source of form and meaning in the universe, however we conceive of it. Then I have a chapter on singing, chanting, and music, the power of music, because, again, this is something in every tradition, from shamanic societies with the whole tribe dancing and singing together, to people singing in churches, to chanting in Sufi ceremonies within Islam, to people chanting in Hindu temples, singing bhajans, and so on. This is part of every tradition, and for reasons which are very clear. It makes people more connected with each other, brings them into resonance with each other, and also with the whole tradition through which this has happened, with great health and mental benefits. Then there's rituals. Every society, every culture, every religion has rituals, and rituals connect us with other people who we're doing the ritual with all those who've done it before, and with those who'll do it after. And this is where my own hypothesis of morphic resonance, which I haven't talked about today so far, comes in, because morphic resonance says that if something's very similar to the way it's been done before, there'll be a kind of resonance across time. And this is exactly what people think is happening in rituals. And finally, I discussed pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is a very ancient practice. Again, it's found in all traditions. It's going on a purposeful journey to a sacred place, a place where heaven and earth connect. And in Europe, there's a tremendous revival of pilgrimage going on at the moment. Although Europe's extremely secular nowadays, I mean, the percentage of regular religious observance is very small. In Britain, regular church-going is about 5% of the population. It's about the same in Sweden and France. In America, it's much more. It's about 45 to 50%. America's much more religious than Western Europe. But pilgrimage in this very secularized Europe is undergoing an astonishing revival. The most famous pilgrimage is to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. And in 1987, when the pilgrimage had just been revived and the infrastructure put in place, there were about 1,000 people walked there. Last year, 280,000 people walked there. And there's a resurgence of pilgrimage going on in Britain and Scandinavia and in other parts of Europe. So I think all of these are ways in which we can be reconnected to the realm of the spirit, whether we're religious or not religious. All religions combine a whole range of spiritual practices. There are a lot of people today who are not religious, but who are spiritual. And so it's certainly possible to be spiritual but not religious, and millions of people are. So I think we're in a new situation, really, where it's possible to be religious and rediscover the spiritual traditions within your own religion. it's possible to be spiritual but not religious. And even atheists and materialists are discovering the benefits of these spiritual practices. So I think it's a new situation we're in, and a very exciting one.
It's very you in the sense, it's a wonderful book that it's put together with that combination of obviously research and insight, but also some tact, where it's arranged in such a way that as a spiritual person, I'm nodding along vigorously and picking up some really interesting concepts to take forward personally. But if I were a empirical or materialist empiricist, by my own set of criteria, I have to do these things. I actually have to go to church or temple or whatever it is I come from a family perspective. And I find that this is kind of coming back to the Pythagorean thing. There's a really deep philosophical, if not statement, then posing of a question in this book that creeps up on you. I think it's a marvelous achievement.
Good. I'm so glad you like it, Gordon.
Wonderful.
It's very reassuring.
Yeah. Well, I have been a fan of yours for many years, Dr. Sheldrake, so I am very grateful for the time you took to speak to us today. And of course, the information about the books for the lucky UK readers and so on, and the website are all available here in the show notes. Where else? Is anything else you'd like to shout out to the team as we wind this one up?
Well, really, I suppose of course I'd be pleased if people read the book, but even more pleased if, as a result of doing it, people try out some practices they haven't done before. And at the end of each chapter, I suggest 2 simple practices that anyone can do to just get a flavor of any of the practices that they're not already familiar with. So that would be the greatest thing, really, if it actually changes not just people's thinking, but people's practice. And I'd be very happy if that happens.
Wonderful. Well, I don't know what to say other than keep up the very good work, Dr. Sheldrake. I look forward to the next book. This one is fantastic, and congratulations.
Thank you very much, Gordon.
Starting 2018 off with a bang. And actually, I hope to have that banging sound continue, as there are already some great guests lined up for later in the month. Hopefully, normal weekly service will continue from this point, but there is a slight chance next Thursday may be a bye week. Reason being, by the time you're listening to this, I'll be on my new Tasmanian farm, and my internet connectivity will be subject to the scheduling whims of the gods of service provision. But be sure to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcatcher or on YouTube, share it with your friends and allies, and get set for a whole new year of conversations with new and returning guests. Until next time.